The alien princess had been weighed, measured, and discarded by every noble house in the Galactic Union. Too heavy for their delicate customs, too solid for their floating thrones, too real for a society built on appearances. So they sent her to Earth, to a backwater farm where a human would take anything for the right price. But when the farmer lifted her from the shuttle's ramp, cradling her weight like it was something precious, the delegates watching from their hovering platforms went silent, because the way he held her, like she weighed nothing and everything all at once, shattered every assumption they had built their empire upon. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The scales never lied, but they had learned to humiliate. Kalara stood on the ceremonial platform in the Hall of Binding Vows, her violet skin catching the cold light of 1,000 floating lanterns. The delegates circled her like carrion birds, their robes shimmering with stardust and disdain. Behind her, the crystalline towers of the Galactic Union pierced a sky filled with ships from 9 systems, each carrying nobles who had come to witness what they already knew would be her final rejection. She had been weighed by 17 suitors in 17 months, and 17 times the platform had groaned beneath her, its golden surface dimming as if ashamed to hold something so dense, so impossibly solid in a galaxy that prized the weightless and the ethereal. Lord Zenthar of House Crystalline had been the cruelest. He had ascended the platform with confidence, his translucent form flickering like captured lightning, and when he attempted the traditional lift of acceptance, his arms had buckled immediately. The crowd had gasped, then laughed, then gasped again when he stumbled backward, his pride shattered across the marble like dropped glass. "She is not a bride," he had announced, voice trembling with humiliation. "She is a stone pretending to be a star." The other suitors had withdrawn their offers one by one after that, each citing ancient laws about compatibility and balance. But everyone knew the truth. Kalara was too heavy for their floating cities, too real for their courts of illusion, too much body in a culture that had evolved beyond flesh into something lighter, something they believed was better. Queen Seraphine, her mother, had wept behind her veil of shimmer silk, but even she could not argue with the council's verdict. The bloodline required alliances, and alliances required acceptance, and acceptance required a princess who could be lifted, carried, presented like a prize of air and light. High Chancellor Mevris had delivered the final judgment with the detachment of someone reading yesterday's weather. The Princess Kalara is hereby removed from the registry of eligible royals. She will be relocated to a realm more suited to her physical constitution. The word constitution had dripped from his mouth like an insult. The delegates had murmured their approval, their antennae and tendrils swaying in satisfied rhythm. That was how Kalara found herself standing in the cargo hold of a transport shuttle 3 days later, watching the stars blur into silence as they carried her away from everything she had ever known. The pilot, a bored Drexian with 4 arms and no interest in conversation, had handed her a data tablet without looking at her. "Earth," he said flatly. "Farming district. Human male. Signed the contract. Paid up front." He made it sound like she was livestock being delivered to auction. Kalara said nothing. She had learned that silence was the only dignity left to someone the galaxy had decided was too heavy to love. The shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, and through the small window, she watched green fields rise to meet her, like the surface of a world that did not yet know what burden it was about to receive. Daniel Cross had been awake since before the sun thought about rising. The fields did not care about galactic politics or royal bloodlines. They cared about rain and rot, and whether the fence in the north pasture would hold another season. He had fixed 3 irrigation lines, fed the chickens, and replaced a hinge on the barn door before his coffee had gone cold. The farm was small by Earth standards, 60 acres of vegetables and a modest orchard that his grandfather had planted with hands that knew the language of soil better than words. Daniel had inherited those hands, broad and scarred, capable of coaxing life from dirt that other farmers had abandoned as too stubborn or too poor. When the message had arrived 3 weeks earlier, he had assumed it was a scam. Galactic Union. Compensation package. Cultural exchange program. The words had glowed on his old data pad like something from a fever dream, but the deposit that appeared in his account the next morning had been real enough to make him sit down hard on the porch steps. Sarah Chen, his neighbor and the closest thing he had to family, had read the contract over his shoulder and whistled low. "They are paying you to take in an alien," she said. "A princess, no less. Danny, this is either the best thing that ever happened to you or the worst mistake you will ever make." Daniel had shrugged. "She needs a place to stay. I have a place." Seems simple enough. Now, standing at the edge of his driveway, Daniel watched the shuttle descend through the morning sky like a silver teardrop burning through clouds. It landed without ceremony in the clearing near the barn, engines humming a song that made the chickens scatter and the dog bark once before retreating to the porch. The hatch opened with a hiss of compressed air, and the Drexian pilot emerged first, all four arms moving in mechanical efficiency as he checked his tablet. Then she appeared. Kailara stepped into the sunlight, and Daniel felt the air in his lungs forget how to move. She was tall, taller than him by half a foot, her violet skin catching the light like polished stone. Her eyes, dark as wet earth, scanned the farm with an expression he recognized immediately. It was the look of someone expecting disappointment and bracing for it like weather. The pilot gestured impatiently toward the ramp. "She is heavy," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "You will need equipment. We have a hover sled in the cargo hold." Daniel did not answer. He walked up the ramp, his boots making soft sounds against the metal, and stopped in front of Kailara. She looked at him, her face carefully empty, waiting for him to flinch or fumble or call for the sled like everyone else had. Instead, Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that had no agenda except warmth, and said, "Welcome to the farm. I am Daniel. You must be tired from the trip." Before she could respond, before the pilot could object, Daniel bent slightly and slid one arm behind her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. He lifted her in one smooth motion. Her weight settled into his arms like something that belonged there, solid and real and nothing he could not carry. Kailara gasped, a sound so small it barely disturbed the air, but Daniel felt it in his chest like a struck bell. The pilot's forearms froze mid-gesture, his tablet slipping from one hand and clattering to the ramp, and in the distance, on a hovering observation platform that Daniel had not noticed, 3 delegates from the Galactic Council leaned forward in unison, their expressions shifting from boredom to something that might have been shock or might have been the beginning of understanding. Daniel carried Kailara down the ramp, his stride steady and unhurried, and when he reached the grass, he set her down gently, making sure her feet found solid ground before he let go. "You are home now," he said simply, and the words carried a weight the galaxy had never bothered to measure. Kailara stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. No one had lifted her like that, not since she was a child small enough to fit in her mother's arms, back before the measurements began and the scales became her enemy. Every suitor had strained, struggled, made theatrics of their failure as if her weight was a personal offense. But this human, this farmer with dirt under his fingernails and sun lines around his eyes, had lifted her as if she were made of something precious instead of something burdensome. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled somewhere between her heart and her throat, so she simply nodded, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for the wind moving through her hair. The pilot recovered first, his professional detachment snapping back into place like armor. "The contract states 1 Earth year," he said, tapping his repaired tablet with 2 hands while the other 2 gestured toward the shuttle. "She is your responsibility now. The Council will check in periodically. Do not embarrass the Union." He did not wait for a response. Within moments, the shuttle's engines whined back to life, and the silver craft lifted into the sky, leaving behind only scorched grass and the faint smell of ozone. The hovering observation platform remained, however, its 3 occupants watching with the intensity of scientists observing an experiment they did not expect to succeed. Daniel noticed them but did not acknowledge them. Instead, he turned to Kailara and gestured toward the farmhouse. A modest structure of weathered wood and stone that looked like it had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. "You must be hungry," he said. I made extra breakfast. Nothing fancy, just eggs and bread, but it is warm. He started walking, not looking back to see if she followed, giving her the dignity of choice rather than expectation. Kailara hesitated, her eyes moving from the farmhouse to the fields beyond, where rows of green stretched toward a horizon unmarked by towers or floating platforms. Everything here touched the ground. Everything here had weight, and for the first time in 17 months, she did not feel like an apology the universe was trying to correct. She took a step forward, then another, her feet pressing into soil that did not flinch beneath her. The farmhouse smelled like earth and time and something Kailara could not name but recognized as safety. Daniel moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had cooked alone for years, cracking eggs into a cast-iron skillet that had seen decades of use. The table was simple wood, scarred and worn, with two mismatched chairs that did not pretend to be thrones. He set a plate in front of her without ceremony, the eggs golden and steaming, the bread thick and honest. Eat, he said gently. You have had a long journey. Kailara stared at the food, then at him, waiting for the conditions that always followed kindness in her world. But Daniel simply sat across from her with his own plate and began eating, his attention on his breakfast rather than on her, as if sharing a meal with an exiled alien princess was the most natural thing in the world. She ate slowly at first, testing each bite for the bitter aftertaste of pity, but found only warmth and salt and the simple satisfaction of real food prepared without pretense. When she finished, Daniel stood and collected the plates, washing them in the sink with hands that moved with the same care he had shown when lifting her. I thought we could walk the property after this, he said over his shoulder. Help you get your bearings. The farm is not large, but it is peaceful. I think you will like the orchard. Kailara nodded, still unsure of her voice, still waiting for the moment when his kindness would reveal itself as performance or transaction. They walked in silence through rows of tomatoes and beans, past the chicken coop, where birds clucked their gossip, toward the orchard that occupied the eastern edge of the property. The trees stood in patient rows, their branches heavy with apples that caught the morning light like ornaments. Daniel stopped beneath the oldest tree, its trunk thick and gnarled, and placed his palm against the bark with the reverence of greeting an old friend. My grandfather planted these, he said. Told me that anything worth having takes time and tends to be heavier than you expect. He glanced at Kailara, and she saw no judgment in his eyes, only the kind of understanding that comes from knowing soil and seasons and the way strength shows up in unexpected forms. Kailara reached out and touched the tree, her violet fingers stark against the rough bark. The tree did not recoil. It did not measure her. It simply stood, rooted and real, exactly as heavy as it needed to be. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the first failed lift, began to loosen. I have never been to a place like this, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, where everything is allowed to have weight. Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that asked for nothing and offered everything. That is because you have been in the wrong places, he said. Here, weight is just another word for substance, and substance is what makes things real. The days unfolded like pages in a book Kailara had never been taught to read. Daniel woke with the sun and worked until the light bled gold across the fields, and somewhere in that rhythm, she found herself falling into step beside him. He did not ask her to help at first, but when she reached for a basket of vegetables that needed carrying, he simply nodded and pointed toward the barn. When she lifted a bag of feed that would have required 2 men, he showed no surprise, only gratitude. That saves my back, he said with a grin that carried no weight except joy. The work was simple, repetitive, grounding. Her hands, which had only ever held ceremonial objects designed to look impressive while weighing nothing, learned the texture of honest labor. Sarah Chen visited on the 3rd day, her truck rattling up the drive with the confidence of someone who had earned her place in Daniel's life through years of showing up. She took one look at Kailara and extended her hand without hesitation. Sarah, she said simply, I am the one who told Danny he was crazy for signing that contract. I am glad to be wrong. Kalara shook her hand, marveling at the directness, the lack of ceremony or hierarchy. Sarah stayed for lunch and told stories about Daniel's disasters with the irrigation system, his stubborn refusal to ask for help, even when a tractor nearly rolled him into a ditch, his quiet habit of leaving vegetables on the porches of families who needed them but would never ask. On the observation platform that still hovered at the edge of the property, Velithor Prime watched through enhanced optics, his long fingers drumming against the rail in irritation. He had expected failure by now. Expected the human to grow tired of the burden, to demand more compensation, to realize that housing a princess too heavy for her own people was a fool's errand. Instead, he watched the farmer work beside her as if she were an equal. Watched him hand her tools without hesitation, watched him laugh when she accidentally knocked over a water barrel with strength she had not yet learned to temper. "This makes no sense," Velithor muttered to his fellow delegates. "He treats her as if her weight is irrelevant." The delegate to his left, a Quellan named Sarix, with skin like midnight glass, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it is irrelevant to him. Perhaps humans measure value differently than we do." Velithor scoffed, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene below. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire and rust, Daniel showed Kalara how to check the apple trees for disease. He stood close, guiding her hands to the right branches, explaining the difference between healthy bark and rot with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge was a gift best given slowly. When her hand brushed his, neither of them pulled away. The touch lingered, gentle and warm, a question neither was ready to answer but both were beginning to ask. Velithor Prime descended from the observation platform on the 7th day, his robes trailing behind him like accusations. He materialized at the edge of the property, with 2 guards flanking him, their presence designed to intimidate, to remind everyone that the Galactic Council's authority extended even to backwater farms on forgotten planets. Daniel was repairing a fence post when they arrived, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands wrapped around a wooden mallet. Kalara stood beside him, holding the post steady with strength that made the task almost effortless. They both looked up as Velithor approached, but neither stopped working. "Princess Kalara," Velithor began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The Council requires a status report. We must ensure that your accommodations are adequate and that the terms of your relocation are being honored." His eyes flickered to Daniel with barely concealed disdain. "We must also assess whether this arrangement serves the dignity of the royal bloodline." Kalara straightened, the fence post still in her hands, and met his gaze without flinching. "My accommodations are more than adequate," she said, her voice steady in a way it had not been during the trials. "I am treated with respect here. I am allowed to be useful." Velithor's expression tightened. "Useful," he repeated, as if the word tasted wrong. "You are a princess of the Galactic Union. Your purpose is not to labor in dirt like a common worker. Your purpose is to form alliances, to represent the elegance and refinement of our civilization." Daniel drove the mallet into the post, one final time, the sound sharp and definitive, then turned to face Velithor fully. "Seems to me," he said quietly, "that her purpose is whatever she decides it is, not what you folks decided when you gave up on her." The guard stiffened, hands moving toward weapons that hummed with restrained energy. But Velithor raised a hand to stop them. "You speak boldly for someone so far beneath the matters at hand," Velithor said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are a farmer. You cannot possibly understand the complexities of galactic politics or the responsibilities of royalty." Daniel set the mallet down and crossed his arms, his stance relaxed but unmovable. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I understand that when someone shows up at your door needing a place to belong, you do not spend your time measuring whether they are light enough to fit your idea of worthy. You just make room." Kalara felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been dormant, waking with a fierce and sudden heat. Velithor studied them both, his eyes moving from Daniel's weathered face to Kalara's squared shoulders, and for the first time since arriving, he seemed uncertain. "The Council will continue to monitor this situation," he said finally. his voice lacking its earlier authority. "We have not forgotten who you are, Princess, even if you seem determined to do so." He turned and walked back toward the platform, and his guards following, but his steps were less assured than when he had arrived. Above them, the observation platform hummed, a reminder that judgment was always watching. That night, Kaylara could not sleep. She sat on the porch steps beneath a sky crowded with stars that looked different from Earth than they had from the crystalline towers of her home world. Daniel found her there an hour past midnight, a blanket draped over his arm and 2 cups of tea steaming in the cool air. He did not ask permission. He simply sat beside her, handed her a cup, and wrapped the blanket around both their shoulders as if they had been doing this for years instead of days. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the crickets sing their ancient songs and watching the observation platform's faint lights blink like a disapproving eye. "I should not have spoken to Velithor that way," Kaylara said finally, her voice carrying the weight of old training, old fears. "I am supposed to show deference to the council. I am supposed to remember my place." Daniel sipped his tea and considered this, his gaze fixed on the distant fields. "And where exactly is your place?" he asked. "Because from where I am sitting, it seems like your place is wherever you decide to plant your feet and do work that matters." Kaylara turned to look at him, this human who had defied every expectation, who had lifted her without struggle and treated her weight as if it were a gift rather than a burden. "They measured me my entire life," she said, the words spilling out like water from a cracked dam. "Every suitor, every ceremony, every glance from the court. I was always too much, too dense, too solid, too real for a galaxy that had learned to float above everything substantial." Her hands tightened around the cup. "And then you lifted me like I was nothing, and I did not know whether to feel grateful or angry, because if it was that easy for you, why was it impossible for everyone else?" Daniel set his cup down and turned to face her fully, his expression serious in a way she had not seen before. "It was not easy," he said quietly. "You are strong, Kaylara. You have real weight, real substance. But that is not a flaw. That is not something to apologize for." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm with life, and it did not tremble under the pressure of her grip. "The difference is not that I am stronger than those suitors. The difference is that I wanted to hold you. They wanted you to be something you are not. I just wanted you to be exactly what you are." Kaylara felt tears slip down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. The first she had allowed herself since the day of her final rejection. Daniel did not tell her to stop. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply held her hand and waited, patient as the earth, while she finally grieved for all the years she had spent trying to weigh less than her own truth. When she finally looked up, the observation platform's light seemed dimmer, less important, as if the galaxy's judgment had lost some essential power in the space of a single, honest conversation. Word spread through the Galactic Union the way fire spreads through dry grass, quiet at first, then impossible to contain. A human farmer had lifted the too heavy princess without equipment, without struggle, without making a spectacle of her weight. The delegates who had witnessed it filed their reports with clinical detachment, but the images captured by the observation platform told a different story. They showed Daniel carrying Kaylara as if she were precious. They showed him working beside her in the fields, handing her tools, laughing with her under the apple trees. They showed something the galaxy had not seen in generations. Someone treating weight as substance rather than flaw. The footage reached Queen Seraphine in her tower of light and shimmer, and she watched it 17 times, her hand pressed against her chest as if trying to hold her heart in place. She had sent her daughter away believing it was mercy, believing that a quiet exile was better than continued humiliation. But watching this human cradle Kaylara with such casual reverence, she realized she had not saved her daughter from shame. She had sent her away from people who did not deserve her. The Queen summoned High Chancellor Mevris and played the footage without speaking. When it ended, she asked one question: "Why could we not do this?" Mevris had no answer that did not indict their entire civilization. Across 9 systems, the responses varied like weather patterns colliding. Some dismissed it as primitive human strength, a quirk of their denser biology and lower evolutionary state. Others watched more carefully, noticing not the lift itself, but everything that came after. The way Daniel included Kaylara in his work. The way he defended her to Velithor without raising his voice. The way he sat with her under stars and held her hand like it was an honor rather than a burden. Young people especially, those who had grown tired of floating cities and weightless existence, began to ask dangerous questions. If weight was truly a weakness, why did the princess look stronger on Earth than she ever had in the palace? Lord Zenthar, whose failed lift had sealed Kaelara's fate, watched the footage in his crystal chamber and felt something crack inside his translucent chest. He had built his identity on effortless grace, on the ability to drift through life without being pulled down by anything substantial. But watching the human farmer, he saw a different kind of strength, one that did not avoid weight, but embraced it, carried it, made it part of something larger than pride. He replayed the moment when Daniel lifted Kaylara, studying the farmer's face for signs of strain or performance, and found only genuine care. On the observation platform, Velithor Prime received daily messages from the council demanding he intervene, that he find some violation of contract, some excuse to remove the princess from this embarrassing situation. But each day, he watched Daniel and Kaylara work together, watched them share meals and laughter and quiet moments that needed no translation. And each day, his reports back to the council grew shorter, his certainty thinner, until finally he wrote only 7 words that would change everything. The human is teaching us about weight. 3 months after Kaylara arrived on Earth, Queen Seraphine did something no galactic monarch had done in 5 generations. She descended. Not in a ceremonial ship with fanfare and delegates trailing like comet tails, but in a simple craft that landed in Daniel's field just after dawn, stirring the chickens and sending the dog into a frenzy of protective barking. Kaylara was in the garden, her hands deep in soil, planting seeds that Daniel had taught her would grow into something strong if given time and care. She looked up at the sound of the engines and froze, recognizing the royal seal even on a vessel stripped of ostentation. The queen emerged alone, her shimmer silk robes looking almost absurd against the backdrop of barn wood and honest earth. She stood at the edge of the garden, and for a long moment, mother and daughter simply stared at each other across a distance, measured not in steps, but in choices that could not be unmade. Daniel appeared from the barn, took one look at the situation, and quietly retreated, understanding that some conversations required privacy, even if they happened under open sky. Kaylara stood slowly, dirt clinging to her knees, and waited for her mother to speak first, the old protocols dying hard even here. "You look well," Queen Seraphine said finally, her voice softer than Kaylara remembered. "Stronger than I have ever seen you." Kaylara glanced down at her hands, stained with earth and work, then back at her mother. "I am the same weight I have always been," she said carefully. "The only thing that changed is where I am standing." The queen flinched as if struck, and Kaylara saw something she had never witnessed before. Her mother, ruler of 9 systems, architect of alliances that spanned light years, looked ashamed. "I watched the footage," Seraphine continued, taking a tentative step closer. "I watched him lift you. I watched you smile in ways you never smiled in the palace. And I realized we did not exile you to save you from humiliation. We exiled you because your weight reminded us of something we had spent generations trying to forget." She gestured toward the farm. The solid structures, the ground that did not float or shimmer. That real things have substance. That strength is not the absence of weight, but the capacity to carry it. Kaylara felt tears building but refused to let them fall. Not yet, not until she understood what her mother had truly come to say. "I cannot undo what the council did," the queen said, her voice breaking in ways that royal voices were never supposed to break. "But I can acknowledge that we were wrong, that I was wrong. You were never too heavy, Kaylara. We were too weak to hold you." She took another step forward, close enough now that Kaylara could see the wetness on her mother's face, the way even shimmer silk could not hide the weight of regret. "If you want to come home, I will stand before the entire council and declare their judgment void." But if you choose to stay here, with this human who sees you clearly, I will understand, because maybe you have already found the home you deserve." Kaelara stood in the garden, dirt under her nails and sunlight warm on her violet skin, facing a choice that would have paralyzed her 3 months ago. Return to the crystalline towers, where she would be vindicated but always remembered as the one who needed vindicating, or stay on a farm where she had learned that weight was not a measure of worth but a testament to substance. She looked past her mother toward the farmhouse, where Daniel stood on the porch with his arms crossed, not watching them but giving them space, trusting her to know her own mind. The decision had already been made. She realized. It had been made the moment he lifted her without flinching. "I am staying," Kaelara said, and the words felt like planting seeds in fertile ground. "Not because I am afraid to return, but because I have found something here that the palace never offered. I have found work that matters, hands that do not measure me, and a place where my weight makes me useful instead of ornamental." Queen Seraphine nodded slowly, and though her eyes glistened with loss, they also held something that looked like pride. "Then I will tell the council that you have chosen Earth as your permanent residence. I will also tell them that any alliance requiring a princess to weigh less than her truth is an alliance not worth forming." The queen turned to leave, then paused and reached into the folds of her robe. She withdrew a circlet of living crystal, the crown Kaelara had worn during the binding ceremonies, the one that had sat upon her head during 17 failed lifts. "This belongs to you," Seraphine said, extending it toward her daughter, "not as a symbol of what you were, but as a reminder of what you survived." Kaelara took the crown, felt its familiar weight in her hands, and then did something that would be recorded in Galactic Union history as the moment everything changed. She walked to the oldest apple tree, knelt in the dirt, and buried the crown at its roots. "Let it grow into something better," she said. Queen Seraphine departed as quietly as she had arrived, her ship rising into the morning sky and leaving only bent grass and the lingering scent of ozone. Daniel approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate, giving Kaelara time to process what had just happened. When he reached her, he did not ask if she was certain, did not question her choice. He simply held out his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her to her feet with the same easy strength he had shown that first day. "There is a section of the east field that needs plowing," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes warm. "Thought maybe we could work on it together." Kaelara smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than politeness or duty. "Together sounds perfect," she said. They walked toward the field, side by side, their shadows stretching long across Earth that did not care about their weight, only about what they were willing to plant and tend and grow. Above them, the observation platform finally powered down, its mission complete, or perhaps simply irrelevant. And in 9 systems across the galaxy, young people began asking their elders why lightness had ever been confused with worth, why floating had been valued over standing firm, why they had built a civilization that could not hold the weight of anything real. The revolution had begun not with declarations or battles, but with a farmer who knew that the best things in life were always heavier than they looked and worth every ounce of effort it took to carry them. In a universe that had forgotten how to love weight, one man had remembered, and in remembering, he had changed everything.